Welcome to the Alternative Assets Podcast. This is not another podcast about the stock market. Instead, we focus on the rapidly evolving world of alts. The goal of this podcast is to provide original research and insights that empowers you to become a better alternative investor. With each episode, we hope to bring you along with us as we learn together. Thanks for joining. Now let's dive in. Opinions expressed on this podcast by the hosts and podcast guests are for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. Podcast hosts and guests may maintain positions in the offerings discussed in this podcast.
Hi, welcome to the Alternative Assets Podcast. I'm Horacio Ruiz, and my guest today is Anthony Zhang, co-founder and CEO of Vinovest. Vinovest curates a collection of investable wines at different price points. With more than $55 million in investments, today we'll look at the future of the company as it expands into whiskey and Anthony's journey as an entrepreneur. Thanks for being here, Anthony.
Horatio, it's a pleasure. I'm glad to be here as well.
Anthony, we have so much to discuss today. Thank you for joining us. I kind of want to start though, in learning about your background and your history. Really want to start even before your college days, because you are someone would consider a serial entrepreneur. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I've been building businesses pretty much my whole life.
Did you find that, prior to, when you were maybe a young kid, a teenager, you had that entrepreneurial DNA in you?
I think it was always a goal of mine to build a business. I just didn't really know what path it would take to get there. I kind of thought it would be like get into a good school and then get a good resume with internships to get a good job after school and then go get an MBA. And then maybe after that, I'd have enough money to start a business. But obviously, as we'll talk about more on our conversation today, it didn't really turn out that way.
Yeah, it seems like life kind of hands you curveballs sometimes for better and worse, right? And something I also want to get into it with you about taking that traditional path, and kind of taking that path where you kind of are almost called to take that. But your first big company or your first big founding was at USC, where you started a company called EnvoyNow.
Yeah, so EnvoyNow was my first real business. It was a food delivery app for college campuses, much like your DoorDashes and Uber Eats of the world. What really made us special was that we were only available to students. So the app was gated. You needed the EDU email of your school to even be a member. And that meant that our supply network as well as our demand network was all students and teachers. So that enabled an extra layer of trust and community within these deliveries, and got really lucky, honestly, with my first business. I had the opportunity to pitch Mark Cuban and get my first investment offer from him. And a few weeks later, had the opportunity to pitch Peter Thiel. And he was running, or is still running, a program called the Thiel Fellowship, where he literally hands you $100,000, no strings attached on the equity side. But the only stipulation is that you can't be in school. So with kind of the blessing of these two folks who I looked up to and respected my whole life, was able to have the freedom to be able to drop out of college and really take my first business seriously and put everything I had into it.
I know that you pitched Mark Burnett and Mark Cuban, right? At a Shark Tank type of show?
Yeah, he was actually at our school for a guest speaker series. But to your point, Mark Burnett was there and he's the executive producer of the show. So it was an impromptu live recorded version of Shark Tank.
And I read somewhere that he offered to, at that point, when you pitched him EnvoyNow, he pitched you $100,000 for a 5% share. So he gave you a $2 million valuation right there and then.
Yeah, then he took it back, and it was a 10% share. So that was the deal that we ended with. But either way, having a business that's worth in the seven figures to a 19-year-old, that was like the biggest number I could have thought of. I was like, someone thinks my business is worth $1 million. It was such a crazy moment for me to realize that what I was building, which was just really a side hustle, was actually worth something.
Yeah. And so then you're faced with this, was it a dilemma, because you're 19 years old, you have this idea of, hey, I'm going to get a degree. I'm going to take this route and be successful. But all of a sudden it's been kind of derailed. Like, the company's successful beyond your wildest fantasies, right? So early. Was that a tough decision or something that you're like, this is something I have to go for?
It was absolutely something I had to go for, because the opportunity cost of not taking that chance was just something that I don't think I could have stomached. I was very fortunate to be able to meet a lot of entrepreneurs who were maybe a year or two older than me that had also made that decision, and talking with them, and their parents talking with my parents, and all of that kind of helped us make a decision that college is always going to be there for you. Your credits can be paused and your degree will still be there, but this opportunity will not if you don't take it.
Absolutely. I was kind of curious, like if you had a student, or you're in a position where younger people come to you for advice, is it something where you're almost always going to tell them, go for it, or is it something that you just got to weigh each situation individually?
Definitely individually. Like you mentioned, I do get a lot of folks who are either some in high school even, but most in college, that are thinking about dropping out and thinking about running their own business and pursuing their dreams early. And I think my number one piece of advice is that, are you able to still stay in school and do what you want to do? If not, do you have the means to support yourself if you wanted to take a semester off? A lot of people can get sucked into the romance or the glamour of being like a startup CEO, right? That's something that a lot of people look up to, but the reality is that most of us are going to fail, and even those of us who are successful see a lot of failure. And I think that is something that you need to become more comfortable with before you make such a big decision.
Some good advice there. Never an easy answer, right? But at some point you have to weigh the practical with what could be. Could you describe to me, at its peak, where you were at with EnvoyNow? Like how many people were working for you, or who you're working with, and how far along did you get, where you would say that the company was thriving?
Yeah, so we built that business over the course of almost 4 years. Right before we got acquired, we were in 22 markets nationwide. We had a little over 60 team members, and I think almost 2,000 actual student drivers, or we call them envoys, actually delivering on the platform. And we had hundreds of thousands of students using the app.
Wow. So it was thriving, then you ended up getting acquired. And this is kind of where I kind of want to, go on a side road here. Kind of in the middle, right? Or I would say maybe in the middle at some point, you were at a pool party and you kind of dove into a pool.
Yeah, this was about 5 years ago now. I suffered a spinal cord injury during that. To those of you who are not familiar with what a spinal cord injury is, you break your spine and your spinal cord, which controls not just your motor movements, but all of the things that go along with it, your feeling, your sensation, a lot of your kind of things that keep you alive. And instantly I was paralyzed from the neck down, was on a ventilator for almost 4 months after that, and pretty much had to relearn every single thing I knew in life.
So it was almost like obviously your life changed in an instant. How did you balance that, your own kind of personal setback, if I could, a tragedy almost, if I could say that, with this thriving business that you have, this responsibility, right, that you have because you've created such a successful business? Did you feel it was overwhelming? Did you feel like, no, this I'm going to get this done? What was your mindset?
Yeah, I mean, at first it was complete shock and denial of what happened, right? I had no idea that the severity of a spinal cord injury. I'd never met anyone who had my type of accident or condition. I thought it was something just like a broken bone or a car crash, right? Like you can heal bones, you can do rehabilitation to get back there. But what I didn't know was that the spinal cord doesn't really heal like that. My condition is permanent. I'm still in a wheelchair today and have very limited movement in my upper extremities and nothing in my lower extremities. And having that diagnosis brought to me, it took a lot to process. So for the first few months, I was just trying to adjust, fight for my life and be able to get to the point where I can even breathe on my own again. So the business was the last thing from my mind. My co-founders had kind of taken over in my capacity, and we're running the business, but I really didn't know if I would ever even be able to run a business, much less even get out of the hospital. Like, what's my life going to even look like? And it wasn't until, I want to say, 4 or 5 months after my injury until I was strong enough to even be able to use a smartphone again. And from that, I had a desire to at least be like, hey, well, I was a CEO running a business at one point. How's this business doing? I just wasn't there yet until months later. And that's really what, honestly, having that hunger to be like, hey, like I actually do want to go back to seeing if I can run a business. Of course, it's going to be a lot different than I used to before, but I want to try, right? And that took me months to get to that point.
I guess I kind of want to delve a little, even just a little bit deeper into that, like that mindset, right? Of I'm going to come back and I'm going to do this. What changed in you? Like how did your outlook change? Did your kind of maybe the way you saw things personally or kind of on different level change?
It was really, I think, at a crossroads. I had to make a decision because my co-founders wanted to actually return all of our investor money and shut down the business. So I disagreed with that decision, and I had to come back as CEO. No one else was going to run the company if it was just, all the co-founders had left. So for me, I was like, I want to see how far I can push myself, and I want to be able to still do something that I used to love. Right? Thankfully, my don't have any damage to my brain from that accident, so I can still make decisions as a CEO. I just need a lot of help with the actual day-to-day execution and being able to communicate with my team. So that was really the turning point. My co-founders came to me. They said, hey, like, we want to leave. I said, no. And they said, well, we can't have no one running the company. And that's when I told them, I was like, hey, I want to run the company.
At that point, the company had some setbacks. And from what I understand, right, you were able to build it back up.
Yep, that's exactly right. We weren't in a great place after me being out of commission for 6 months. But what I did realize was that I just didn't want to give up on the company. We poured almost 4 years of our life into it at that point, and just to roll over and give up just didn't seem right to me. I owed it to myself. I owed it to our investors. I owed it to all of the employees that we had brought on board to be able to give ourselves one last shot at a good outcome. And that was, I think, what really fueled and drove all of us to turn the business around, was that, setbacks happen, disappointments happen, but it's really how you respond to those and want to be able to show to yourselves and to others that, hey, like, we tried as hard as we could, and we gave it the time of day and the effort and attention that this company deserved, given how much of a time and money investment people had put into it. So I thought that we had, just really seen it through the right way, and thankfully we're able to have multiple buyout offers with EnvoyNow.
Awesome. And then, so we mentioned that, you're kind of a serial entrepreneur. You always had this dream of creating your own business. And the next thing was know your VC. Can you describe what that was? Because I know that's also kind of like it came about from, I guess, a personal incident between you and a friend.
Yeah, Know Your VC is essentially a Yelp for rating angel investors, and it really started because we heard all this terrible news from Silicon Valley VCs, from female and other minority background founders, on how these venture capitalists were really just saying and doing horrible things, not only from a discrimination standpoint, but, even bordering on harassment and assault. And to me, as a very, very fortunate male, was able to come with no connections, but through Mark Cuban and Peter Thiel, was able to quickly fast track myself. Fundraising is always hard, but it was never to the point where I felt like I was being disrespected or I felt that I was unsafe because of who I was. And that just really made me feel so strongly that there needed to be more transparency in this space, where a lot of the deals are done behind closed doors, right? Saw a lot of parallels between what was going on in Silicon Valley and how the whole Harvey Weinstein scandal broke down. And we just thought there needed to be a website where people could share their honest opinions and encounters. And that's how Know Your VC came to life.
In reading about that, I never would have thought that you could, in essence, kind of hold some, I guess, pretty wealthy angel investors, right? Hold them accountable almost. And in some ways, it's almost go back 3-4 years. It would be kind of unheard of, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we really wanted to do something that hadn't really been done before.
So you have that company, but then that also gets acquired, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so then it kind of brings us into Vinovest, which is kind of like your baby. I know you're a co-founder. How did you come across this idea of wine as an investment? And kind of what was your background with wine? Was it something that you already had a deep knowledge of, or something that you kind of have picked up along the way?
With Vinovest, I had really no experience with investing in wine. However, what I did know was that there was value with these old wines, these rare wines, because I'd grown up in Beijing and Hong Kong. From a cultural standpoint, wine, especially wine from France, from key regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy, were just a huge part of society, right? You want to go to a family friend's house, or you're looking to do a business dinner, right? The gift that you bring to them at these dinners or these events really does reflect your level of respect for them. And that's when I knew these wines really had something more than just getting older and changing taste and flavor. What I didn't know was how strong of an asset class it was. I remember a few years back, before I started EnvoyNow, just researching like, hey, what are the ultra wealthy people investing in these days? And kind of no surprise, at the top of that list was like art, wine, whiskey, jewelry, all these sort of luxury asset classes, or passion asset classes, as people call them. And I was like, hey, I've always been interested in wine. I'm no expert, but it sounds like a really fun way to be able to dive into a potential passion while also making some money on the side. And after I spent a few weeks just researching the space and talking to folks that were a lot more experienced, that had been collecting for years, maybe even decades, I realized why wine investing is thought of as such an exclusive or sort of behind closed door things, is that there's so many barriers to entry, right? From storage to the right knowledge of which wines are investable versus not, and then the access, right? A lot of these wines are not available publicly. You need to know someone who knows someone to be able to get your hands on a bottle, even if you can afford it. And all those problems, it stems back to, I think, just giving everybody a fair chance, making things knowledge accessible. That was the same problem I tried to solve with Know Your VC in a very different space. But at the core of it, Vinovest existed, and I wanted it to exist because we wanted to bring more accessibility into this really exclusive, elite, closed off asset class like fine wine.
What was that like? I know you mentioned previously fundraising and how that's almost like a constant. How do you go about fundraising for a company that's going to start offering these investments in some of the most expensive, one of the most expensive asset classes? How do you go about acquiring all these great wines from all these different regions across the world?
Yeah, so for Vinovest, all of it was just from my own experiences at first, right? I didn't have room to store wines in my apartment here in Los Angeles, so I reached out and found professional storage facilities all around the world next to key wine growing regions. I didn't really know what to pick for wines, so my co-founder and I, we designed an algorithm and we put that onto the wine market data and back tested it. We didn't know. Now that we're like, all right, the algorithm can tell us which wines to buy, we didn't have access to those wines, right? We didn't know where to buy them and how to buy them. And that's when a little bit of luck came into play. My next door neighbors in the apartment complex, their daughter and son-in-law are both master sommeliers. For those of you who don't know what a master somm is, it's essentially the highest level certification that you can obtain in the wine industry. There's less than 300 people ever who have even obtained that level of title. So these folks were wine industry experts, veterans, like they are very much so ingrained with the top of the top. And after I told them about my concept for Vinovest, they were excited. And having that industry buy-in was key for us when it came to sourcing these wines, especially as a new company.
I got to go back. We talk a lot about hard work, skill, and all that you need all that. But then to have the son and daughter, right?
Yep.
Of the next door neighbors being these people that there's less than 300 of in the world, right? That's a pretty cool thing to happen to you.
Yeah. What are the odds, right? So especially in a business like wine investing, it's not like any Silicon Valley entrepreneur has this sort of chance encounter. So definitely consider myself very lucky. So
let's talk about what you've built up so far. You have wines from all around the world. let's talk about it from on your side, right? What are the offerings? What are you looking to constantly kind of like acquire? Does that change over time? And like you said, you have all these different regions. Do you have contacts in different parts of the world?
That's exactly how it is. Even though Vinovest is based in LA, we've got our contacts and our infrastructure all around the world. So if our wine is bought in Napa, we're storing it in the Napa warehouse. If the wine is bought in Bordeaux, we're storing it in the Bordeaux warehouse, and vice versa. So we want to, by default, keep the wine as close to where it's produced and stored as possible. That minimizes any sort of risk around the storage of the wine, and it also helps us from a environmental as well as a cost saving basis.
Definitely. And you mentioned also your algorithm that you developed with your co-founder. Does that get constantly tweaked or changed? Is that kind of how you get the recommendations for the investors?
Yeah, so we do. We want to be able to always update our algorithm according to new movements in the market, according to new things that we learn that can potentially help our strategy. So it's something that we're constantly tweaking to be able to have better returns for our investors.
So now going on the investor side, let's say someone's looking to sign up with Vinovest. They have three options, correct? They have where they invest $1,000, they invest $5,000, or they can invest $50,000 or more if they want. Is that right?
So you can invest any amount between $1,000 and up. What those plans are, we have plans at the 10K, 50K, and 250K level. They bring additional benefits, reduced fees, additional experiences, and then also a different level of service. Right? The entry level starter plan is fully automated. You're working with a robo-advisor. We're making all the decisions for you. But when you start to get into those higher plans, you get a dedicated portfolio manager. And if you want to be able to source something special and have a little bit more control over your investing experience, that's where we tend to see more investors gravitate toward.
And you actually, the investors, when they go into those different levels, they actually own a whole bottle, right? The bottles of wine themselves. They don't own a fraction of the bottles. They don't own a share of the bottles. They own the bottles themselves.
Exactly. So this is a pure investment into the wine bottle, the wine case. You're not sharing with anybody. You own it. You can actually even drink it if you wanted to. It's real and it's all yours.
Also, what I saw on there is you have different also risk tolerances, right? So a potential investor will answer the questionnaire and they'll be asked a risk preference and then they'll put in a certain amount. What are the differences in wines? If you can tell us, like, let's say I'm a conservative investor and I want to put in into the $5,000 fund. What's the difference in the type of wines in a conservative portfolio for $5,000 as opposed to a risky one, I guess, for $5,000?
Yeah, great question. So just like stocks and bonds, traditional investments, it's your equivalent of like a blue chip wine. These would be wines that are maybe from Bordeaux or Burgundy or a very established wine region. The price increases are very steady, low volatility, and very predictable. And on the other hand, if you want to go more speculative or risky, there are your equivalent of emerging market wines, right? These are maybe newer winemakers or newer wine regions or newer wines from an established winery that offer a little bit more upside, but with more risk. So that's how we look to balance people's risk appetites. We also take into account their time horizon as well as the dollar amount, right? If you're putting in $5,000, we're not going to be buying you a $5,000 bottle of wine because you wouldn't be diversified. We want to give you lower price point wines that can give you exposure into different regions, into different vintages, so that even within the asset class of wine, you can still enjoy diversification.
So let's say I have this fund, it's at $5,000 and I check back, let's say 6 months later, and I find that a couple of my bottles have appreciated, by a couple $100. At that point, do you have the ability to sell your bottle? How liquid is it? Because you can take the bottle and you can consume it yourself. So that in that sense, it's very liquid. But how liquid is it if I want to sell off the investment?
Yeah, so if you want to be able to sell, we do have an open market. So we can sell your wine to anybody else who's a counterparty on our platform, whether it be a retailer, a high-end restaurant, another wine collector. And it's, I would say, much like an open market where you can see all the active bids and offers on any given wine and be able to then exit your positions that way if you choose to.
And what are the price appreciations? How do you track those? How do you track whether or not a certain wine or brand has started to appreciate or even depreciate?
Yeah, great question. So we track all sales all around the world. So to us, a sale is the same as a trade, right? It's somebody selling a bottle of wine to another person. And we want to be able to track and normalize all those data points that are happening, whether it be for consumption or investment, right? And that helps us be able to then in turn give investors a more up-to-date and accurate mark-to-market. So for example, if I sold somebody else the same bottle of wine that you have for $300 a bottle, that's the updated mark-to-market, right? That's the most recent transaction that's happened that can help you determine what you can reasonably expect for your wine too.
Is that related? Because I saw you have the index fund, right? You put 100 different wines and you use that to also kind of track, I guess, the whole wine industry, right? And its appreciation. I know it's a little bit different here. All these data points go into kind of tracking the historical value of these wines.
Exactly. So that one is very much so if you want a broader sense of like, hey, how's the wine market doing, right? Just like there's an S&P 500, look at the greatest 100 wineries and the wines they produce and are able to then track those prices on the secondary market.
How has that gone with the investors? Who are your investors right now? Are they retail investors, kind of individuals, or are you beginning to see bigger, I guess, companies or funds kind of show interest in what you're building?
Yeah, so it's both. We've got those two segments where the retail investors, they're using our platform and are able to then self-direct and be able to put in however much money they want. And then on the other hand, we've got the more so institutional side, your RIAs, family offices that are managing money on behalf of others and looking for wine as a means of diversification.
Do you see one market getting bigger than the other or growing faster than the other?
I think for us, we're really seeing explosion on the retail side. I think for RIAs and other institutional investors, even though the dollar amount is larger, right, there's just less of them out there. We could get 1 million users and maybe get 100 RIAs, but maybe those 100 RIAs are actually putting in more money than those 1 million users combined.
Yeah.
So there is that sort of gut dichotomy there where some of them, the big clients are worth more, but there's just going to be less of them.
And then you guys have recently expanded, right? Do you find yourself that you're always kind of in the middle of a fundraise because there's always the next thing and then the next in the sense that, you want to grow the business, you want to get more investors, but also like, are there certain trends that you're spotting and that you kind of want to grow into different areas?
Yeah, for us, like we're really using the capital that we raised to just build a better customer experience. We're still very early. A new thing that we're really proud of that we launched about a month ago is our mobile app, which is just another step of making investing in wine that much more accessible. And when we look at opportunities, not only are we looking at different opportunities within our own user base, whether it be going global or targeting other segments of the market, but we also see value in being able to build a reputable brand in this sort of wine and spirits category. So one thing that we will be launching next year is whiskey investing. And like wine, whiskey enjoys a lot of the same price and return dynamics, but also is plagued by a lot of the same accessibility problems, right? Who's going to have space in their home to store a giant cask of whiskey? How do they get their hands on that whiskey? How do they accurately price it? Who do they sell it to, right? Those are all problems that we've solved with Vinovest and built expertise in that we can then be able to translate into the playbook for an adjacent asset.
I know that, whiskey and wine, they kind of, they go together, right? They're fine, investments in kind of like spirits or fine wines. But from what I understand, right, whiskey is almost even more difficult. Like even proving the provenance and keeping track of the product sometimes. Can you talk about the challenges in going from wine to whiskey, or do you find that they're actually, it's pretty relatable?
For the most part, they are very relatable. Provenance is a problem in the wine world, in any sort of luxury good world as well. Knowing where that asset is from, storage and insurance are also big problems. And I think the other thing is accurately valuing, right? If you have a limited edition bottling where there's only 200 of them ever, how do you make good price comparisons and be data driven with your analysis? So those are all really interesting challenges that we're running into every day on both the wine and on our exploration of the whiskey side.
Yeah, it's funny because we've done a couple of analysis on alternative assets about, with very expensive whiskeys. And we did one recently and there was maybe like one comp, right, in the last year, 2.5 years. Raleigh was fractionalizing a Karuizawa whiskey, and we're looking at it and we come to realize like there's only been one sale and it was an auction. It wasn't even like a private sale or anything like that. Yeah, it's some of this stuff is so rare, right? And some of it is so new, right? Because it's been stored for so many years. It's a fascinating kind of space.
It is. And it forces you to get creative, right? When you only have one comp and it's not really a direct comp, what can you do to be able to become informed and data-driven enough to be able to confidently make a recommendation?
I kind of want to focus a little bit more with the Whiskeyvest, right? Where do you want to see that go? Is it kind of going to be like a similar setup to Vinovest? Or do you feel like maybe now that you have like the second class, there's some different things that you can do with, the user experience or even the investments themselves?
Yeah, great question. So it's really going to be seamless and feel a lot like the Vinovest platform. So we'll have one login, multiple portfolios where you can be able to view wine and whiskey, wine or whiskey, up to you, and having the same sort of guarantees and assurances around insurance, around authenticity, around condition, to make sure that asset is safe and always yours.
Yeah. And at the moment, when do you anticipate maybe launching that?
I would say this is something that we'd like to do next year. Not really sure what the timeline would be there.
One more question here, Anthony. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about your team and what you've built, right? Because like we discussed earlier, you have this, you're operating on a multinational level, right? What is the breadth and scope of your team right now? What does it take to run a Vinovest?
Yeah, we're really lucky to be a globally decentralized company. Even before the pandemic hit, my co-founder and I, Brent, we were like, hey, we want to just build a real company from the core. So it's in our DNA. That's also enabled us to hire incredible individuals from all walks of life, from all places, countries, states, all different time zones, which I think has really helped us be able to grow our expertise now that we have coverage in Asia, in Europe, in the Americas. And we're able to have that sort of global coverage because wine is global, right? Wine is grown in different places, stored in different places. Our customer base lives in different places, and we want to be able to accommodate that and in the best way that we can.
And with that, I kind of want to add on something because you're good at this. I know you are. What would be your pitch for a potential investor who's looking at wine as an investment, and then specifically at Vinovest as the platform to go to for those investments?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're looking to diversify into something that's uncorrelated with the market, that's, I think, the first decision, right? And I think number two is looking at your time horizon. If you are looking for something that is around, I'd say at least 3 to 7 years at the minimum, then wine could probably be a good asset for you in your portfolio. And then when it comes to actually managing the asset, Vinovest is really the place to do it because we do everything for you. You have the flexibility of being able to check on your smartphone like it was your Robinhood or Schwab account, but you also have the flexibility of being a wine drinker. You own that tangible asset. I think, especially in these sort of inflationary days, this is especially important to be able to have that sort of hard asset as a part of your portfolio.
Awesome. Andy, thank you for sharing your story. I know your background, and for talking about Vinovest. Really incredible. When I first heard about your company and you, I was like, oh, this is really cool. And then maybe a couple weeks later, I come to find out more about, kind of some of the adversity that you faced. And I was like, wow, okay, there's another layer there. So I just want to thank you for sharing that. It speaks volumes about, I guess, the depths you would take to go and work something out and kind of not let something fail and to continue working and persevering. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And very much so. Learn to be an open book through my journey, through tough times and through good times. So I appreciate you giving me the chance to speak about it too.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. I'm sure it's going to be our listeners' pleasure. Hopefully we can have you back soon at some point in the coming months and kind of get an update, maybe even talk a little bit more about if Whiskeyvest is live.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again. I enjoyed the chat, Horacio, and hopefully we can do this again soon as well.
Absolutely. Take care, Anthony.